So I haven't made a video in a long time. I am now in grad school, have been for a while, and my program involves doing internships as well as obviously going to class. And something that I've been thinking about is that for basically all of my adult life, I've worked as a personal assistant to people with disabilities. And as somebody who has a disability myself and sometimes needs accommodations or needs to do things in a different way, in my jobs, there's kind of this informality and flexibility, which is one reason why it's been a good job for me. Because when I need something, I can just kind of talk about it and negotiate it with the people involved. And it's not like what happened if you work in an office and you might need to get HR to read your formal documentation that you had to get from a doctor and say that you're allowed to have an accommodation. So now suddenly I'm kind of in these more formal situations and I sometimes run into things that don't work for me, and I'm kind of at a loss because I'm afraid of trying to get documentation again. The last time that I got assessed for disability stuff was 12 years ago when I was 22, and it was traumatic, and I feel weird saying that about seeing a doctor, but it has had a pretty big effect on me, I guess, to the point that if someone tells me okay, I'll make that accommodation for you if you can formally go through the disability service office and have documentation, I'm just guess I'll die, JPEG. And I'm trying to think about why that is, and it's pretty obviously this specific experience that I had being assessed for the last time. So it's just kind of been sticking in my head, so I thought I would talk about it. I know that I've written about it before, but it was a long time ago. It was basically back when it happened that I wrote about it. But it was this psychologist made me cry multiple times by just refusing to listen to not only my own feelings, but just kind of a simple explanation of kind of the current thinking on autism, which he wasn't aware of. Yeah. So just to rewind, this happened in 2011, and the handbook, you probably know, that is used to diagnose learning disabilities and developmental disabilities and mental illnesses is called the DSM. Don't ask me what that stands for, even though I'm literally in a social work program and I'm taking 10 classes on the DSM right now. I don't know what it is, but it's currently the DSM-5, and the language in this one is very ooh-woo, spectrum-y, schizophrenia spectrum and autism spectrum, and kind of recognizing that people can kind of present in different ways but have the same diagnosis, and people can have different support needs across the spectrum, all of which I think is really great. But that came out in 2013. So when I was growing up in the 90s, we had the DSM-4. And in the DSM-4, basically all the people who are now considered autistic had one of three labels. It was called autistic disorder, which was usually people who were non-speaking, and then the other two were Asperger's and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. I was diagnosed with both of those two at different times in my childhood, and basically most autistic people like me who can talk would have been diagnosed with one of those two. And sorry, I'm looking at my notes. There's also another thing called nonverbal learning disability, which will come up, and that is not in the DSM, and it wasn't in the DSM then. It would just have been coded by the clinician as learning disorder not otherwise specified. And just going off on my own opinion, but not only my opinion, nonverbal learning disorder is basically a term for when you test in a certain weird way on an IQ test, where you have a much higher score on one section than the other section. I'll get into it more later, but basically autistic people who can talk, like me, almost always test that way on an IQ test. So some autistic people might say that nonverbal learning disorder is almost like a euphemism for autism, where either the clinician has a stereotype of how autistic people look, and so they don't give you that diagnosis because you don't look like that, or the clinician feels that it's a stigmatized diagnosis and they don't want to give it to you because of that. So Anyway, I was also diagnosed with nonverbal learning disorder, of course, because I meet the criteria, which is literally just that I test on an IQ test the way that a lot of autistic people who can talk and don't have an intellectual disability test. So yeah. Anyways, so I grew up and I was assessed like so many times by like so many different doctors and psychologists, and I actually always liked it. Like, it just got to feel like this safe environment where I would go into an office and I would meet a new person and they would give me a bunch of tests and give me a bunch of games to play, and it was like, okay, like, you know, usually everyone's mad at me, but this is what I'm supposed to be doing, I guess. Sure. And like, when I was about 20, when I was in college, was kind of when I made a lot of the videos that used to be on this channel that I mostly took down. But it was when I kind of sort of got to see having a disability as like really part of my identity. Like, I think I always kind of grew up thinking that it was something I needed to hide, and I really only thought about my appearance in terms of kind of wanting to look typical, or wanting to maybe like spin my disability in a way that would be like more acceptable to other people. But by the time I was like in college, I obviously was having to live on my own and live more independently, and that's kind of when it really just showed up that like having a disability really affects my ability to take care of myself. And it was actually just like this really big shock, because unfortunately, especially when I was growing up, like autism was always kind of framed in terms of like, you know, we don't like the way that autistic people look and act. And so I was like totally concerned with how I looked, and like not really understanding like that I actually had a lot of cognitive disabilities that like affected my ability to do stuff. And yeah, it actually is pretty annoying to think about the fact that I was being constantly assessed, and, you know, did spend like some time in like special ed programs and stuff, and just like wasn't really being given tools or strategies to deal with like the actual problem that would actually affect me as an adult, which is scientifically termed like brain problems. So like, basically I'm in my early 20s and I'm kind of, my mental health is like in the toilet, because on the one hand, like, I'm becoming like really involved with like the autistic community and like having friends who like work in disability rights, and I'm also starting to work as a support worker for autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities and people with physical disabilities, and I'm getting very excited about like disability and disability solidarity and kind of like unpacking ableism and all these ideas that have kind of like always been inside me, but that like I haven't really been able to express because I'm kind of afraid of my own identity. So in that way, it was like a really exciting time. But on the other hand, like, I think it sort of hit me that my life was going to be pretty hard because it's really hard for me to do a lot of regular stuff. And that sort of the, I'll get to this in a minute, but this is kind of the classic nonverbal learning disability presentation that other people will typically think that I look smart and won't necessarily believe that when I'm like, I can't brush my teeth, or like I can't ride a bicycle or whatever. And so like, don't want to be like too graphic, but I was having a really hard time functioning because I kind of felt like I didn't want to live the rest of my life, because I think just like knowing that like I was going to struggle for my whole life, and that I kind of felt like no one around me would believe me, is something that like in a lot of ways I guess is still true. And I think I've just like grown up enough to kind of like live with the fact that there's a discrepancy between how other people see me and the way that I know my life is. And I've just come to a lot of peace with that just like didn't really seem possible when I was young. But at the time, it was really hard and it felt like unbearable, and I felt like I just like so badly wanted some sort of like objective proof that like my disability was like actually real. So my parents I grew up with parents who had a lot of money, which probably is obvious from the fact that I just described getting like 5,000 assessments when I was a kid. So when I was 22, I asked my parents for like a final assessment. And I thought, okay, this will like explain everything, and I'll go out into the adult world with like this documentation that will, I don't know, prove that I'm legit. And I'm not sure if I said this, but just to clarify, like in 2011, it had already been announced that the DSM-5 was going to have like the autism spectrum instead of using all these different diagnoses. And I wasn't super involved, but was kind of like watching friends of mine who are autistic and were advising on that, kind of helping with the development of the criteria. And I was in school, and in like my psychology classes, like we would talk about it a bit because it was kind of like a high profile thing. There was lots of drama and discussion about whether like we should all be in the autism spectrum or have different diagnoses. But actually among like autistic people that I knew, like everyone just identified as autistic and like not with a particular diagnosis. So in a way it was almost like, you know, you would personally like identify as autistic with your autistic friends, and then like when you went out into the world you had to be like, I have Asperger's or whatever, because that's like the word that people knew for like autistic people who could talk. But it was actually kind of like the DSM was kind of catching up with like how we were already talking, so that was actually kind of something that we liked. So anyway, the DSM-4 still said Asperger's, autistic disorder, PDD-NOS, but it was going to change, and that was widely known, except by the psychologist that I went to get assessed by. And this is a thing, he didn't believe that I was autistic. And when I say that he didn't believe I was autistic, I don't mean that we had like a factual disagreement. It's not like I went in and I was like, you know, saying that I don't know, had like paranoid schizophrenia, and he was like, no, you don't have hallucinations and like all the things that you say you have. It was like he didn't understand the concept that someone who could talk could be autistic or could identify as autistic. And like even at this point, like the idea that like people who can talk can be on the autism spectrum wasn't like, I feel like had been fairly well established for like a pretty long time. But this psychologist, I think, mostly kind of worked with people with learning disabilities, like specific learning disabilities and ADHD. And it seemed like he, I guess, maybe wasn't really interested in autism, and he hadn't followed all of this, and he like didn't know about it. And I think in general, I don't see this big distinction between like ADHD and developmental disabilities. Like to me, like ADHD is basically a developmental disability. Like it obviously affects people's ability to do everything. It's present your whole life. Like I just don't get the difference. But it just seemed like he saw like developmental disability as some like totally separate thing from like the people that he worked with. And like I remember when I first met him trying to sort of give an example of how like I had trouble doing something, and I described how I had trouble doing something, and I also compared it to like a client that I had worked with who had Down syndrome, and how he also sort of like spaced out when trying to kind of complete daily tasks in the same way that I did. And the psychologist was like, well, you don't have Down syndrome. Like, thanks. Like, I know that I don't have Down syndrome. I was just drawing a comparison because honestly, I think all of us in like developmental disability world do have a lot of intersections. And I think when I look at other people with disabilities, I sometimes see things that give me insight into myself and vice versa. And I don't think that's bad. And I think it's unfortunate that like you can't hear someone say that without thinking that they think that they have Down syndrome. So anyway, the conversation that I kept like repeatedly having with this doctor was, you know, I'm autistic, like that's an important part of my life. A lot of my good friends are autistic. I'm involved in the community. So when I'm talking, I might mention being autistic. Every time that I said I was autistic, the doctor was like, what? because he didn't know that autistic people can talk. And so I was like, yeah. And he was like, well, maybe you have Asperger's, but you're not autistic. That's like a completely different thing. And I was like, actually, and I explained that in the DSM-5, it was going to change, but that also, you know, Asperger's, autistic disorder, PDD-NOS had always been this spectrum, and they were all connected. And so you could really arguably refer, even before the DSM-5, you could refer to these other people as also being autistic. And I feel like I like pretty patiently explained this to him, and he was like, oh, so that's the new thinking. Which, like, you would think would mean that he at least understood what I meant when I referred to myself as autistic. But instead, just like every single time that me being autistic would come up or be mentioned, he would be like, what? You're not autistic. And it was like I just kept explaining the same thing to him again, which he could have just like Googled, but he didn't seem to be familiar with it, and he couldn't remember when I told him. And he actually saw me as having ADHD, which, like, I definitely will not, like, say that I don't have probably all the characteristics of ADHD, but, like, there's a lot of overlap. Like, at this point in my life, I wouldn't be offended if someone thought that I had ADHD. I think I was offended at the time because being autistic was kind of like this thing that I had recently embraced, so I was kind of confused by him constantly putting a different label on me. But at this point, I'm kind of like, you know, I don't really think like ADHD is the best description. I think autism is a better description, but like, sure, like we all have a lot in common. Like, I'm not like, you know, if someone gave me like a really good book on ADHD and it really helped me, I'm not going to freak out. Like, we have a lot in common. But back then, it was just like the guy was just like, oh yeah, you have ADHD. And it was like, no, I'm autistic. But whatever. I kind of had sort of like the first session talking to him, explaining my situation. And again, like, my mental health was in the toilet. Like, I was actually pretty messed up over these anxieties over like having a disability and feeling like it wasn't apparent to other people and like no one believed me. So I literally, like, I already started crying in like the very first session that I had with him. And anyway, then it was time for kind of the assessment. There was like a barrage of tests, which I love. Like, I think I went in for like 2 or 3 days and just went in and just had to take like all these tests. And like, as usual, it was like this experience that I loved from when I was a kid, like just going in and just like focusing and just like taking a test. And like, if you do well, that feels good. But if you do badly, like, it's just trying to give information. Like, it's not like you failed. So I just enjoyed it. I was having a good time. But, you know, eventually when we're talking about the results of the test, it's like, well, it seems like from what you describe in your life, I guess you have ADHD, and from this test, you have nonverbal learning disorder. So to go into it a little more, like, nonverbal learning disorder basically means that when you take an IQ test, and forgive me for like the dumb way I'm going to describe this, but like your ability to like understand language is just like better than your ability to actually do stuff to sort of a significant degree. So that obviously has a lot of effects in how people function. I couldn't really tell you about it because like I'm not a psychologist, but it's basically the way that a lot of autistic people test on an IQ test. And I think the way that people describe nonverbal learning disorder literally just sounds like describing like a verbal autistic person without the stereotypes, because it's just kind of explaining the issues that they have without trying to project like, you know, autistic people don't think that other people have minds or whatever. Instead of like projecting any of that stuff, it's literally just like the person, like, you know, can read really fast but like can't tie their shoes or like read a clock or like all this other stuff. And yeah, so anyway, so obviously like the thing about nonverbal learning disorder that I think is like so strange is that like if you think like I do that it's just the way autistic people do on IQ tests assuming that they don't have an intellectual disability and they can talk, like, it should just be like a really easy way to identify autistic people. Like, we don't necessarily have to freak out over like who looks autistic or like pinning down all these like little ideas of what an autistic person is. If you actually maybe can just sort of test and like often get a good idea if someone's autistic. For some reason that just like never really happens. Anyway, so he was like, yeah, you have nonverbal learning disorder. And I was like, yeah, I'm autistic. That's why I test that way. And of course, like, it's like, what? You're not autistic. And like, this conversation had just gone like on and on and on. Like, every single time he forgot that I identified with the word autistic, and he forgot why. And like, every single time he was like, oh, I thought we agreed you're not autistic, haha. And it's like, no. And he sort of conceded, like, well, since you have nonverbal learning disorder, like, technically you have Asperger's. Like, at least he admitted, like, that is the same thing. But he still was, like, very weird about the word autistic, which, like, looking at it in retrospect, given that, like, 2 years later that became, like, the official DSM language, like, I'm wondering what he did then. Because, like, I don't know why he was so resistant to something that had kind of been growing for a long time. But yeah, we just had this interaction over and over and over and over again. I remember at one point, like, he didn't like that I identified as autistic. He thought I should identify as Asperger's or something. And I was like, well, in my community, we use this language. And like, as I started to say, well, my community, he cut me off and he was like, I don't care about your community. I don't care what your community does. So yeah, I think as time went on, we had sort of had this argument so many times that he sort of kept coming up with excuses to never finish his like assessment, his like written assessment of me. So I'm trying to remember, I think like this happened during like winter break from college, and then I went back to school, and then I had to keep seeing him on breaks or something because he kept like not doing the assessment, and he kept like canceling appointments with me, and he kept like coming up with all these like family emergencies and reasons that he couldn't finish it, whereas like initially he'd been very like pretty reliable and present. He just kept like putting it off. So finally, my last meeting with him was in like a different location. I don't know why. It was in this like little dark room, and all I remember is, again, I mean, I'm laughing now, but I was in an extremely difficult time in my life when the idea that like people wouldn't believe that I was autistic like upset me more than anything else. And I was like talking to him, and once again I said that I was autistic, and he was like, what? No, you're not autistic. And like I just started crying. I just started like sobbing. I don't really remember how he reacted. He probably didn't care. And so I think I just kind of left. And so my mom talked to him and convinced him, I guess, to put that I had Asperger's. And what she told me was that like she just told him that I stim. Because I've just always, as long as I can really remember, when I was growing up, such a kind of like shame block was put on kind of like traditional stims, like hand flapping and jumping, that like I do them a lot, but like on the subconscious level, I literally like can't do them when I'm being watched or when other people can see me. So like, I know when I was younger, I like made some videos and pictures where I showed myself stimming, but it actually wasn't real stimming. That's just me doing an impression of myself stimming, because it wouldn't be possible for me to stim if I know that I'm being filmed, which is still kind of weird, especially because I think I'm like a lot better adjusted now, but it's still like very much that way. Anyway, the doctor like hadn't asked me about stimming or talked about stimming at all, but I guess he thought that I didn't, and he like put that into his perception. And so my mom had to come and like meet with him, and I guess she made the case. Like, I guess, you know, my own tests and like my own feelings and thoughts couldn't make the case, but my mom's made the case for him to say that I had Asperger's in the assessment, which is kind of annoying since that immediately became like outdated. And also, like, I just went looking for the assessment and I cannot even find it. I must have like thrown it out or something because it was so shitty. But yeah, so that was my experience. And I'm just kind of thinking about it. Like, I just, even though I literally helped brainstorm some of the stuff that's in the DSM-5 to make the autism diagnosis more inclusive and easier for adults and easier for women to be diagnosed, I still have this feeling that, like, if I go and see a psychologist, they're just gonna be like, nope, you're not autistic. And like, somehow I guess I have this feeling that my entire life and reality will just like pop, which is dumb. I mean, I know myself, and I think, like, I don't know, diagnosis is really complicated because obviously they're just words, but at the same time they have a lot of value. And it's weird that somebody who may not even like be that educated about your diagnosis and can even be just actively incorrect, like, is sometimes like the professional who gets to say what you are. Just thinking about it.